chilling tales for dark nights.
Everybody Loves a Parade, written by Charlie Davenport, performed by Jason Hill. Peter lay still in the early morning hours, feeling the press of the coming 365 days and the chill of winter nipping around the edges of his covers. He remembered the advice one of Shelby's friends had given him when he first arrived in California. 2 years, a gregarious fellow named Gabriel had said, as they sat on lawn chairs sipping away on Tecate and other beers Peter had never encountered before. Streamers hung overhead, and a decimated piñata dangled from the basketball hoop, battered from the assaults by Gabriel's children. Stretched out above it all was a store-bought banner that proclaimed, "Welcome back, Shell." Handwritten in black marker was the tag, "And welcome, Pete." Peter felt that it was a nice addition. "Yeah, 2 years for what?" he asked. "To assimilate," Gabriel said, though in his current state speaking through equal parts tequila and Negro Madeo, the word snuck past his lips sounding more like simulate. "You know, to feel like SoCal is, home." Peter still hadn't fallen into the rhythms of the place. He felt a little odd wearing shorts in October, and his New England accent still proved to be a source of amusement for far too many people. The cashier at the supermarket up the street had actually asked him to repeat words in his native dialect, "ka" and "yad," before she would hand him his change. Peter suspected he would never quite simulate, but there was nowhere else he'd consider home. Where Shelby was, wherever that might be, would always be where he belonged. Their first date back in D.C. had lasted 8 hours, covering everything from her childhood in Northern California to her research at the university, and, most importantly, her very definite plans for what to do in case of a zombie apocalypse. In the weeks that followed that first date, Peter discovered that life was divided neatly into 2 periods of time. The time with Shelby, and the time away from her. Within a month they were living together, and, when she announced a job opportunity had come up in California, Peter didn't debate relocating for even a moment. Less than a week later, he'd successfully gotten his request for a transfer to the California branch of Bellator Corp., approved at the speed unheard of in the firm's history. Now, sitting in bed, Peter looked out their window on Wrigley Lane. Ordinarily, the sky above his home was a uniform, featureless pale blue. But after half a decade of drought, El Niño had come back and brought the first honest rain that Peter had known in this place. For a week, there were actual clouds above. They had been dark and full, too. Today, however, they held back at a respectable distance above the town. It was, after all, parade day. Peter watched Henry, their son, lying still on the tiny screen of his baby monitor. In the distance, he could barely hear the preparations for the festivities. Nothing definite, just the wind carrying the occasional bang of a drum or snippet of a voice, broadcast over loudspeakers. He picked up the TV remote. The NBC affiliate was covering the parade. The perennial hosts sat in a booth above the route, their practiced smiles plastered tightly to their faces. Peter watched as the first float came into the camera's view. Posies, river reeds, and other arranged vegetation illustrated a collection of fanciful scenes that flowed from jungle to peaked castle. The float's riders moved from scene to scene by way of slides placed between them, They cavorted with all manner of bizarre, multi-limbed creatures as fanciful aircraft and spaceships bounced overhead. The tradition of the parade had begun years ago, when people like him, transplants from the frigid East, decided to celebrate the warm paradise they now inhabited. It had been held every New Year's Day since 1890, save for those that fell on a Sunday. Locals said that the founders had made a nodding agreement with the Almighty when the floats rolled out on that first day. They vowed to never hold it on a Sunday, and, for his part, God would never let it rain on the procession. Looking at the horizon and the line of rolling black clouds held at bay, Peter could almost believe it. He heard the bedroom door open and his wife appeared a moment later.
"How's Henry?"
she inquired. Peter held the baby monitor in his hand up to her and, as if on cue, their son let out a comically loud snore. Shelby's face broke into a grin above her puffy eyes.
"He's so cute,"
she said adoringly.
"Did you make tea?"
"Not yet," Peter replied. Shelby gave him a jokingly disapproving look.
"Oh, you know the rules, Mr. Sandow. You wake up first, you make the tea. At least get the water started."
"And I'm sorry, Dr. Sandow, I don't know what I could have been thinking."
Useless.
She smiled and shuffled towards the kitchen to fulfill the task in question. "Happy New Year," Peter called after her. Her head and shoulders appeared at the door.
Shh.
She pressed her index finger to her lips and then withdrew her hand to point at Henry's door.
"Happy New Year, honey,"
she replied with a smile. A small wail came from both the screen and Henry's room, announcing that their little boy was ready to join the rest of the world. "I got him," Peter said as he got up from the couch.
"Yeah, you do,"
Shelby called from the kitchen, silence no longer a concern. They got Henry changed, fed, and dressed. His tendency to sling formula around made it madness to try it in any other order. Shelby made waffles while Peter prepared mimosas for them to sip and marinated steaks that would later be placed on the grill. Periodically, they would check in on the parade's progress, marching bands and well-groomed horses weaving their way down Colorado Boulevard between the floats. They'd yet to go see the parade in person, at least not the one during the day. Anybody wanting a reasonably good live view either had to be part of the media coverage or sleep out on the sidewalk the night before. After the parade was over, though, the floats would park at a local high school parking lot. Folks would be charged admission for the chance to walk around and view all the care and craft that went into putting these wonders together. Peter and Shelby had discussed taking Henry to see them when he was old enough to remember it, but that was still years away. After everyone got an eyeful of the blossom-strewn works of art, they'd be gathered up into a convoy. The greenery would be tied down with a skeleton crew doing various tasks to keep the floats together as they drove several miles to the stadium. There, they'd be taken apart, stripped of their finery, and rendered nothing more than bare wire frames. It was what Shelby called the nighttime show. The year they'd first arrived on Wrigley, they celebrated the New Year much as they did this year. They cooked and watched the parade, doing a fair bit of day drinking while they observed. The days of carousing and imbibing like it was an occupation had passed them by. Peter suspected, now that Harry was with them, that there was a very good chance they'd soon stop staying up until midnight as well. The prior evening's festivities consisted of him watching a rerun of Family Guy, while Shelby slept on the couch beside him. When he roused her to tell her it was midnight and marked the moment with a kiss, she muttered something and trundled off to bed without another clear word passing her lips. The year before had been so different. That evening a year ago, Shelby had stuck her head up against their great bay window and slightly wide-eyed gestured for Peter to follow her outside. Most of the neighbors were already gathered outside, watching the floats pass by, slowly chugging along down the main road toward the stadium. Standing there, the two of them watched the gray shapes approach, their remaining glory revealed in the wavering pools cast by the streetlights overhead. It was a stripped-down, spontaneous encore of a performance, a great, secret show that only the locals knew about. Standing there in the chill of that evening, Peter occasionally looked at his neighbors, people that strangely did not generally interact with one another. But that night, each time he caught someone's eye, the two would smile at each other and nod in a companionable way. No one spoke, no one hollered. There was a kind of reverence to this. Dozens of floats passed by. Occasionally, the riders, those maintaining these temporary vehicles for the last few miles, would look up from their labors and wave. The group watched until the last in the convoy, a bizarre little scene depicting various prehistoric creatures crawling out of the La Brea pits, faded into the darkness. Shelby stood in front of him, allowing Peter to wrap his arms around her. Together, they silently bid goodnight to their neighbors as all retreated into their homes. That night, as they settled into bed, Peter felt sleepy, heavy in that delightful way sometimes felt before a wonderful night's rest. The day had been peaceful, the night almost magical. He slid over to his wife and buried his head in her hair, breathing deeply as he drifted off into sleep. After a time, he found himself, without explanation, no longer in his bedroom, or the formless nothing of sleep, but instead at the corner of Colorado Boulevard. Above him, the sky was clear and cloudless. He soon became aware that he was not alone on the street. Cardboard people of every age and hue had formed rough lines on both sides of the boulevard. They all wore the same vacant, rigid smile secured to their faces, and Peter could smell that they reeked of rotting flowers. As one, they turned their heads, their eyes wide with some indiscernible emotion. For a terrible moment, Peter was certain that they were staring at him. But following their gaze, his eyes fell on something on the distant horizon. A speck along the curve of the earth, tiny as a drop of blood trickling its way down a pricked finger. He stood with the gathered crowd, unable to look away from that far-off thing. Soon he could feel its approach reverberating in his chest. He began to make the object out, identifying distinct individuals that comprised a column of people. He watched as each one, in perfect time with one another, would raise one leg and bring it down with a brutal crack against the asphalt, only to repeat the motion with the other leg a moment later. With each strike, Peter could make out more details. They wore uniforms, drab gray with brass ornaments flashing from the chest and shoulders. They made Peter think of military cadets, or a marching band. He soon saw that all of the figures carried an instrument of some kind, either in front of them or hoisted on their shoulders. Then he could hear the music they made, or at least it was something like music. Cymbals crashed and drums banged out at odd arrhythmic intervals. Horns of every description blared shrill notes in horrendous counterpoint to the synchronicity of the band's marching feet. Every few feet, one of the marchers would tear free from the crowd and post along the route, blocking the mass of humanity that had gathered to watch from coming any closer. Each onlooker wore the same static idiot leer as those standing around Peter, but all of their eyes burned with an unnatural intensity that spoke only of simple hatred. After hundreds, maybe even thousands of them passed by Peter, he saw a single float making progress down the street. A simple flat bed, with wire frames rising from it, covered only in patches of wilted or rotting flowers. A small collection of people milled around those patches. Some were elderly, others looked to be in the prime of their lives. Some held children in their arms. No one looked particularly happy or sad. Their eyes simply moved languidly from one side of the route to the next, showing no particular interest. They did not speak to each other. They didn't even seem aware of each other. Well, except for the two that rode at the front of the float. One was a young woman dressed as though she'd just come from the gym, likely a senior in high school or a college freshman. There was something wrong with her, though. Her posture looked stooped, broken somehow. Her face was strained with the tremendous effort it must have taken for her to simply stand. Each jostle of the decaying platform brought a fresh expression of agony to her young face. Her hand rested on the shoulder of an elderly man seated in an old wooden chair. The touch seemed as much out of a need for support as any sign of affection it might have meant. The elderly gentleman vacantly scanned the crowd as he waved to them, but received no recognition except their ever-present toothy grins. From the man's position, Peter immediately guessed him to be the Grand Marshal of this procession. Periodically, the elderly man's eyes would roll to the back of his head. He wore an ornate crown that pulled with such a weight on him that his neck lolled to the side. Peter wasn't entirely sure, but it almost looked like it was made of thorns. The young woman tapped the marshal on his shoulder and pointed downward as they passed Peter. He watched the old man allow gravity to snap his head toward him, and over the cacophony, Peter heard a voice as old as time say one word: "Hello." And then he was awake. Peter sputtered around for a few moments as the dream slowly bled away from him. He calmed down and began taking in the world around him. In his own bedroom, he became aware of the complete, blurred stillness of his surroundings. There was a small, hitching noise that he couldn't first identify, as if it was coming to him through cotton. His surroundings refused to come into clear view. As he began blinking his eyes furiously, he found that they were filled with salty tears. Had he woken up crying? Shelby bolted up and over his stuttering breath asked Peter what was wrong. He had no words to describe it, except that he'd had a nightmare. She cradled him and slowly ran her fingers over his brow until he drifted back to sleep. When he awoke again, he'd largely forgotten about the disturbing interlude. There were bills to pay, birthdays to remember. Days turned into months, and in February of that year, Shelby announced that their family was to grow by one. With the press of everyday life and impending fatherhood, there was no time to dwell on a single night of poor rest. That is until one night, while watching the news, Peter rubbing Shelby's shoulders, they came across the story of Cynthia Ann Ryder. The story itself was not remarkable. Most people will hear a version of it at least once a year or more. A local teenager on her way back from a party tries to run the spotlight, just enough alcohol buzzing through her system to never see the truck that had the green. According to the report, she told her parents she was meeting up with some friends after soccer practice. Miss Ryder's body was thrown from the vehicle. She expired at the scene. Both Shelby and Peter remarked on the event with the offhanded and directionless sympathy most have upon hearing such a story. The next day, however, while sitting at his desk, Peter thought about the girl and felt a sharp and suddenly pressing need, to put a face to the name Cynthia Ann Ryder. Peter searched for her name and came across a few LinkedIn and Facebook profile results. people looking for new employment opportunities, and one young lady in Ohio that had won a county spelling bee the previous April. After a bit of sifting, he came across the Cynthia Ann he was looking for on one of the local news station's websites. He scanned the details about her from the article. Good student, taught soccer at a summer camp for underprivileged youth, a wonderful big sister to her 9-year-old brother. None of these or any of the other assorted details about her life set off any bells for Peter. But when he saw her photo, a tickle pressed at the back of his mind. Something oddly familiar about the slope of her nose, the shape of her eyes. Where do I know her from? Peter wondered about the girl for the rest of the day. At meetings and in casual conversation, it gnawed at his every moment until he laid his head down that night. When his head touched the pillow, he smelled Shelby's shampoo, and, for the first time since that day so early in the year, he remembered the parade. He put Cynthia's face to the shattered form of the girl riding the float in that nightmare landscape, and he recalled the old man, the Grand Marshal. He wanted to jolt upright, to do something about the whole ordeal. What was that going to be? He had no idea. But it was already too late. He felt himself slipping into sleep as though he were sliding irreversibly down a long tunnel. When he emerged on the other side, he was along the parade route again, and the float was drawing close. There was no sign of the young woman in her gym gear who would never see her first semester of college. Cynthia Ann Ryder had shuffled off this life. The parade had moved her along. Peter saw the others still riding with the marshal, their eyes drowsily scraping the crowd as they passed. There was someone else standing by the marshal now, a dark-skinned man with a severe militaristic manner. His face was smoothly shaven and placid, his eyes full of shrewd wariness, looking out at the crowd with the same intensity he'd leveled during staff meetings back in D.C. Peter could place that detail because, unlike Cynthia Ryder many nights before, he recognized this man. He had worked with him for the better part of 5 years, and while they hadn't been friends, they'd certainly liked each other enough to engage in polite conversation. Peter would ask about the man's family, and Clarence Wise would ask how Pete's gal was getting along. He looked just as Peter remembered him. That is until he turned his head. That simple motion gave Peter full view of his former co-worker's face, and the ghastly wounds that had destroyed most of it. The lower part of Wise's jaw had been pulped by some terrific force. Whatever it was had traveled up past his left eye and exploded out the top of his head, turning his cranium into some kind of gory, improvised funnel. This grotesque parody of his old friend stared at Peter, recognition lighting in his sole remaining eye. Peter saw Wise's mouth attempt to form some kind of word as he bent toward the marshal's ear. "Hello," said the Grand Marshal. Somewhere within the infinite weariness of that voice, there was also a hint of familiarity. Peter was an old friend come to visit, someone that the marshal expected to see again. Upon waking and taking the time to gather himself, Peter started making calls back to every number he still had in his phone from the D.C. office. But, it being a Saturday, there was no answers until he tried Kenny Bryden's number.
"Hello, Bellito Corp. This is Kenny Bryden. How may I help you?"
Kenny's Jersey accent clanged across the line. "Hey, Kenny, it's Peter Sandow." It had been 2 years, and though he'd been in the cubicle opposite Kenny for a long time, he had no expectations of being remembered.
"Petey!"
the boisterous voice proclaimed. Despite his 57 years, Kenny was full of bounding, aggressive optimism. that could be both just what you needed to hear in the middle of the week and the most grating thing on a Monday morning.
Is it you blowing up every phone in the office? You forget what day it is?
No, I was hoping to catch anyone, really. I'm trying to get a hold of Clarence Wise. Had a question I thought he could answer. Kenny sighed deeply.
It's not likely.
Peter felt cold.
Rumor is, yesterday, Clarence got up early and made breakfast for his kids. He told his wife he was headed out to the garage get something out of his car, or something like that. After an hour or so, she went looking for him.
He could already picture Clarence walking down the perfectly shoveled path from his house, his head hung low, moving with the same purposeful stride he always had.
She found him in the note he'd written, apologizing for the mess.
Kenny shuffled the papers on his desk loudly enough for Peter to hear them in California. Well, did it say why? Peter did not want to ask how. He was certain he already knew.
Don't know, but I doubt it. He wasn't the type to complain.
An edge of admiration was present in Kenny's voice. Peter struggled through a few more minutes of question and answer with Kenny, but in the end none of it lodged too deeply in his memory. Clarence Wise was dead, by his own hand, and he had known in advance. It would follow that pattern again and again. A relative he hadn't seen in years had died of a heart attack while jogging. A drunk had killed a neighbor's child because they just refused to take a cab home. On the evening news, a family of 4 died in an avalanche in Colorado. Peter saw every last one in turn take his or her place alongside the Grand Marshal. There was never enough time to do anything about it, though. No appointed time was ever given, no address, no set of instructions that led him to being at the right place at the right time. He was simply the nightly witness to the parade and its passengers. There were times in the early morning hours, tears burning his eyes for the umpteenth time, that he considered joining Clarence. But there were still bills to pay. He had a job with the increasing responsibilities that came with climbing the corporate ladder, and he was trying to balance all of it with a new child in the house, trying to find any gaps in the baby-proofing measures he and Shelby had taken. So his nights, filled with unease and terror, slowly became just another fact of his life. Somehow he managed the day-to-day miracle of not simply cracking from the strain. At the start of October, his branch manager, Mr. Rivers, called him to the 4th floor, home to senior management, to discuss a project that he'd been working on for the company. The lower floors were all open concept space, cubicles with dividers so low that you could see all your coworkers at once, facilitating collaboration, said the administration. When the elevator doors slid open, Peter noted that the managers had more traditional offices, granting them such luxuries as walls and doors. Peter knocked upon arriving at Rivers' door. Mr. Rivers invited him in as he sat comfortable behind his overly large and imposing desk. He was a neatly attired man of some indeterminate middle age, wearing a double-breasted suit that was a few years out of style. His double chin and earnest attempt at a comb-over did not detract from his air of authority. Another man with a full head of stark white hair sat in front of Rivers but made no move to turn around as Peter approached.
Ah, Peter. Please, have a seat.
Rivers rose slightly and gestured at the chair next to the white-haired man.
Do you know Tom Bedford?
Peter had heard the name and had seen pictures on the company's website. Mr. Bedford, the director of West Coast Development, Mr. Bedford presenting to the shareholders. Mr. Bedford meeting with regulatory officials in D.C. Mr. Bedford biking down the 101 on a charity ride he organized every year. Sponsored by Bellator, of course. "I don't believe we've met before." The man in his casual polo shirt exuded a virility that Peter never believed he could achieve in his own lifetime. Bedford stood and, smiling, offered Peter his hand. "Hello, Tom Bedford, and I've been hearing some great things." The rest of his greeting was difficult to hear as the blood pounded in Peter's ears. "Hello. Hello. Hello." The word he'd said to Peter almost every night that year. Every night as he wore that awful crown on his head, his grimacing face turned towards the sky, his eyes flashing white as if in mid-seizure. "Hello." Standing before Peter in Mr. Rivers' office was Tom Bedford, head of West Coast Development for Bellator Corp. Standing before Peter in Mr. Rivers' office was the Grand Marshal of the parade. The meeting carried on for a while. Peter responded to their questions, offered projections for completion. At the end of their time, seeming pleased with the results, Bedford excused himself as he had to run to another appointment. He thanked Peter for his time. As an afterthought, he told Peter that he was certain they'd meet again. Peter successfully fought back the urge to shriek in the man's face. It was Friday, after all, and near enough 5 o'clock to go home. He stayed up late that night, desperate to avoid sleep. But after a number of beers meant to fight the rising panic, his eyelids announced their resignation to their fate and slid over his eyes as he sat on the couch. He was once again on the corner of Colorado Boulevard on a clear and cloudless day. The crowd gathered, the band struck up the music, and the parade's column moved down its appointed path. At last the float, the one he'd seen so many times, drew near, and Peter saw that Tom Bedford alone rode atop it. Without the weight of the others to balance it, the float bucked and rattled like a rickshaw, only emphasizing the horrible gesticulations of Bedford's form. It groaned to a halt in front of Peter. The music stopped. The marchers were gone. The murmur of the crowd had ceased. Peter looked around him and was alone with the marshal on the route. Peter, in absolute certainty, had only one thought. It's me now. It's my turn. He thought about Shelby finding his corpse on the couch in the morning. He thought about her raising Henry alone. He wept. And he kept weeping until he heard the marshal's voice croak out a single word. Goodbye. And with that, Peter was awake on his couch, feeling the edge of a nasty hangover approaching. Upon opening his work computer the following Monday, he saw a new email in his inbox with the subject line, "A loss in the Bellator family. It is with sadness that we must inform you that last Sunday Tom Bedford suffered a dreadful crash on his bicycle. Though all efforts were made, his injuries were too severe for him to recover." The rumor around the office was that it had first seemed an insignificant accident. Another rider had drifted too close to Bedford, and in his attempts to avoid the crash, he had fallen headfirst off the trail into some brambles. The jovial man had laughed off the scratches from the thorns, simply taking some aspirin to combat the ache in his head. After arriving home, he'd drawn up a chair at his kitchen table and told his wife that whatever she was cooking for dinner smelled great. Mrs. Bedford was confused, as it was 10 o'clock and nothing was in the oven. A moment later, Tom Bedford, a man in phenomenal shape for his mid-50s, fell off the chair and began writhing on his kitchen floor. In the weeks and months that followed, Peter did not dream, not of the parade, not of anything at all. He was grateful for the simplicity of shutting his eyes and finding nothing waiting to greet him. The whole thing receded and seemed more of a fevered notion he once had than a memory of real events. Halloween came and went. Thanksgiving followed. Then Christmas. And before he knew it, New Year's Day was almost upon them. Now, as they sat and watched and clapped along with Henry at everything that tickled his fancy, Peter felt happier than he had in a long time. They watched everything together, from the riders on their majestic horses to the marching bands to the floats themselves. At one point, Shelby leaned over to her husband when Henry seemed so excited that he might burst at any minute. She whispered that she couldn't wait to see what Henry thought of the nighttime show. As the evening came, they gathered with their neighbors as they had the year before, and watched as the wondrous fabrications were transported past their street and out into the night. Peter stood next to Shelby with Henry in his arms, listening to every delighted "ooh" that came out of his son, and, for the first time since his last dream, wondered if he might see the parade one more time that night. That night, with Henry tucked safely in his crib, Peter lay next to Shelby with his eyes fixed on the darkened ceiling above him. Again, he did not want to sleep, fearing that this period had been a lull, the eye of some storm that had been waiting to toss him back into the water again. He fretted and turned for hours as Shelby snored heavily next to him. But in the early hours of that January morning, his head heavy with fog and half-formed plans, he eventually drifted off. The crowd welcomed him back as one of their own, and the band nodded their recognition as they passed. Peter stood impassively, letting the event wash over him as the float rattled into view. On it, he saw the fresh gaggle of the young and old, the healthy and the sick, the deserving and the tragic. One by one they would announce themselves to him and then go on their final way, for some reason, for no reason. Peter supposed it didn't matter. With a muted interest, he saw that someone new, a woman, sat in the chair at the front of the float. It made sense, of course. Bedford was gone. He had given up his place of honor and joined the rest in whatever place they went to over the horizon when their time had come. Peter leaned forward and could see that the once beautiful woman's sun-kissed skin and brown eyes were now ravaged by disease, a condition of which she was not yet even aware. She probably wouldn't know for another year about that thing slowly turning her into a poor imitation of the vibrant being she'd once been. In the waking world, his fists balled up by his sides, and he began driving them into the mattress repeatedly. A tiny voice that was more like his son's than his own, wailing, "No! No!" Peter knew her long before she passed by him. He remembered meeting her on a random event 2,000 miles away from where they lived now. He knew her long before she waved. He could almost smell the hospital room where they'd held their son together for the first time. He knew her long before she said hello. As he watched Shelby pull away from him for the first time that year, Peter knew what Mrs. Bedford must have felt after the paramedics came for her husband. He knew what Clarence Wise's wife had felt when she saw what depression had done to her one and only. He knew what Cynthia Ryder's family had felt the morning after the accident. He knew what Henry would feel as he grew and the slivered memories of his mother would slip away from him. Peter felt alone, and the parade carried on into the night.
Chilling tales for dark nights.